Crisis in Egypt. A little-known armed group takes responsibility for killing a high-ranking military officer. As well as security, the country struggles with food shortages and price hikes. So how's the government dealing with the challenges? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. There seems to be little respite for an Egyptian government plagued by challenges. Rising food prices and Sinai insecurity are producing some of the latest crises. On Saturday, a senior army officer, Brigadier General Adel Radgai, was killed outside his home in Abur city, 35 kilometers northeast of Cairo. He was an armoured division commander who had served in northern Sinai. And that's where the government has been fighting several armed groups, including those it says are linked to ISIL. Hundreds of soldiers and police officers have been killed. This just adds to the political instability since President Hosni Mubarak was forced to step down in 2011. Its first democratically elected leader, you'll remember, Mohamad Morsi, was deposed by the military. Then General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi became president and led a major crackdown against the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, fighters in Egypt have killed hundreds of policemen and soldiers, mostly in the Sinai Peninsula. But such attacks on senior officers are rare. Let's take a look at the group that's taken responsibility for killing the Brigadier General then. The newly formed armed group called Liwa al-Thawra, or the Revolution Brigade, said on Twitter it was behind the attack. Its Twitter account was suspended shortly after it made the claim, though. It's the first time the group rose to prominence was when it targeted policemen in Munafia province in August. 2 police were killed during an ambush and 5 others were injured, including 2 civilians. Now, Egypt's security situation has been unstable. The military is fighting several armed groups in the Sinai, and the violence has increased since President Mohamad Morsi was deposed. The lack of security has hurt Egypt's vital tourism industry, which was already struggling after the 2011 revolution. That's left the government facing an economic slump, with a high unemployment rate of around 13% and rising inflation. Many blame President Sisi and his government for the problems. Let's get the thoughts of our guests. We have here in Doha Mohamad Elmasry, Associate Professor of Media and Cultural Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. In London, we have Omar Ashur, Senior Lecturer in Security Studies at the University of Exeter, and also in the British capital, Wafiq Mustafa, Chairman of the British Arab Network and author of Egypt, The Elusive Arab Spring. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Omar in London. Who is this group, the Banner of Revolution, that's claimed responsibility? What do we know about them?
Well, not much really. The group came to the fore in September when they issued and took responsibility for an attack on a small police unit and killed most of the soldiers. Most of them were low ranks. Took responsibility for that, issued a statement which was quite unique in a sense that it was not religious intensive, if you wish. It was not using a lot of Quranic verses like some of the jihadist group or some of the armed Islamist groups do. It was talking about the people being the only source of sovereignty, only because it's a very thorny issue. Is it the people, the ultimate sovereign, or is it God within the Islamist and jihadist debate? So it was taking this stance, more on the peoples are the sovereign, the ultimate sovereign. And it more or less elaborated on it is fighting to gain back the objectives of the revolution, framing its narrative more or less around social injustices, economic deprivation, and so on. So that was a low rank, and it was in more or less a range of small, relatively speaking, decentralized organizations that popped up after the July 2013 coup. Some of them ended like Ajnad Masr. Some of them formed into or formed a coalition like the Popular Resistance. It was composed of 5 of these smaller groups. And then also their campaign ebbed to a certain degree. And then now we have the Revolution Brigade. The Revolutionary Brigade, now this is a big operation. This is not like
all right, let me jump in here, Omar, before we get into the actual operation. Let me take the question to the studio here. Why target? We got a little bit of brief there background about the group, but why target this Brigadier General Adil Ragai?
Well, he was actually one of the people leading some of what the Islamist groups in Sinai perceive as repression against both the locals in the Sinai province and also the people of Gaza. He was overseeing specifically the operations against the tunnels that link Egypt with the Gaza Strip. Right, these are tunnels that have been used to transport vital goods to the people in Gaza. So he was responsible.
He was responsible for a big area, wasn't he? 5 governorates, I think. I mean, the Sinai, even part of Cairo. Yeah, I mean, is it possible to pinpoint the reason why he was targeted as being what's going on the Gaza border, in Sinai, or the instability in Cairo?
I think it's probably a combination, right? But these armed groups, it's not, these high-ranking Egyptian officers travel in a lot of security. It's not easy to get to them, right?
Right.
So this is a situation where he had left his house without much security. Certainly that, the insurgents were monitoring his house. They had an opportunity, and from their perspective, they seized it. But I think the larger issue here is the backdrop of violence. We've seen a cycle of violence in Egypt that's been going on now for the better part of 3.5 years. You saw the state perpetrate massacres against civilians. There were the mass death sentences, obviously the mass arrests, the torture in the prisons. And then you've seen quite frankly, very predictable pushback. All these dormant
forgive me,
groups that Omar
I do want to.
of.
That is a very good point, which we do want to pick up on about the cycle of violence and where that's taking the country. But before we go too much big picture at this point, let me bring Wafiq into the discussion, and if we could focus on this particular assassination. How sophisticated of an operation does this appear to be?
Yeah, first I would like to condemn the attack on this officer. And in my heart and my prayer to his family. The second thing, it is clearly there is an unanswered questions about how did this gang of extremists or revolutionary got through to the house of this high-ranking officer, because he lives in an area which is well protected, well secured, and the story is not complete somehow.
And they seem to know his movements and his timings pretty well.
Exactly. Is this an insider job, or it's the government has been more or less forcing blackout on the news or a comprehensive investigation of the site. Media is not allowed, and only few short statements which has been distributed. It raises a lot of questions, how they were able to get through, how they were able to escape so easily, and there is a lot of questions. I'm quite puzzled about the whole incident of killing such a senior military officer. Particularly, he's surrounded by many officers too, around living in the same district. So
right.
I feel there is more political sides to it than just blaming one side or another.
Do you think, Mohamad, that this represents some kind of new stage in the battle between the armed groups and the authorities, looking at the rank of this officer, looking at the fact that he was assassinated in Cairo rather than the majority of sort of, shall we say, Sinai-related violence, if this is what it is, that usually takes place in the Sinai, doesn't it?
Right. I think it's too early to say. I think we need to see what the coming weeks hold. But I think it's important to call to mind, this is not the first time a high-ranking Egyptian government official has been targeted and assassinated. Just over a year ago, Hisham Barakat, the prosecutor general, was targeted not in Sinai, but he was targeted and assassinated in the heart of Cairo, in the midst of a lot more security than Adil Ragai was in.
So that was a year ago.
Right. Well, that's why I'm saying we have to wait and see what happens in the coming weeks and in the coming months to see if this is some sort of an escalation or if this is just the insurgents kind of picking their spots, if you will.
Well, maybe now's a good time to turn to the question which you posed, the bigger picture. But let me take that to Omar Ashur in London. Omar, the big picture of the cycle of violence, the government efforts and vows that it was going to destroy what it calls terrorism, armed groups. What does that picture look like today?
Pretty dismal. The situation is as follows. The regime post July 2013 decided to escalate its an already military campaign that was going on since 2011 in the north of Sinai. But this time the escalation was unprecedented in Egypt's history, really. You had for the first time aerial bombardment in civilian areas, using heavy artillery in civilian areas based on some sort of intelligence that there are 5 armed men moving in this area. You had the accusations for General Ragai was destroying some of the homes and the farms on the border area with Gaza, and the statement that was issued by the brigade, by the Revolution Brigade, basically takes some of the numbers that were the interesting part is that this is some of the low estimates. This is the numbers of Human Rights Watch and some of the low estimates on what was going on there. It's exactly the same number repeated in the statement to basically justify the murder. That's on one end. On the other end, you saw the Sinai insurgency specifically gaining more capacities, able to hit, as you know, a few days ago, able to hit in the west of Sinai. Most of the insurgency is centralized in the northeast of Sinai, was able to hit in the west of Sinai, and you know, between 2013 and today was able to strike in Central Delta, in Upper Egypt, in Cairo, and in the Western Desert. You saw also a level of sophistication that is more or less unprecedented as well in Egypt's modern history in terms of the guerrilla warfare tactics, the ability to
now, Omar, how much coordination
artillery.
is there between these different groups?
I don't think there's that much coordination except of having a common enemy. They seem to be varying in their levels of capacities, in their sophistication, in their locations. Right. The networks that the decentralized, the smaller groups, usually operated in about 5 governorates, Cairo, Giza, Bani Suef, Fayoum, and Sharqiya. Most of the action was going on there. The ones in North Sinai took responsibility for specific operations in Central Delta, Cairo, and Upper Egypt, but it was one operation. So one-off time, issue a statement, say specifically why did they do it, and then it ends there.
Right,
that case is one of the most complex cases because this is the highest ranking senior military officers that get assassinated since Anwar Sadat, since President Sadat in 1981. So to be able to pull that off and disappear, this is a big
well, it
change.
requires a level of
end
sophistication and planning, obviously, to do that. Wafiq, if we broaden it further out, how worried are authorities about any possible return of street protests, particularly with November 11th looming in the air and the vows to organize more street protests from some of the opposition quarters?
I think that's a very important factor, which really beg a lot of questions about what Sisi and the military going to do about 11th of November protests. Because I have a feeling there is a division in the military itself about Sisi's leadership. And as you could see, the economy is collapsing. The Egyptian currency virtually lost more than 50% over the last 2 years alone. And the Egyptian economy is collapsed, and there is a political isolation of Sisi as well within the Arab world, within the Middle East, and within the world at large.
But Wafiq, I mean, who can organize a serious sort of street protest challenge to the government right now? I guess supporters of the regime there could argue the Muslim Brotherhood has been smashed. Many of the leaders of some of the more secular youth movements have been arrested. Is there anyone out there able to rally and mobilize large numbers of people?
I could imagine it will be very difficult, particularly after the killing of the general. It will be a big pretext to increase the hand of the police in the street, and repressive measures will be taken. A lot of people will be arrested. There will be a lot of media calls for no protests. I think it's a very big pressure on the Egyptian youth and on the young people in the media as well. A lot of them, about 50 or 60 young media people, newspapermen, have been jailed. There are 60,000 people in jail right now in Egypt. I feel the Egyptian regime is going to use this as a pretext to use very hard tactics against anybody who will come down in the street on the 11th of November. But I hope the people will defy this, because that's been going on, and Egypt is going to collapse as a country if it continues like this, particularly some countries in the Gulf have started even pulling away from Egypt.
Okay, Wafiq mentioned there the economic situation. If you look at some of the basic statistics like inflation, of course, and prices, very sensitive issue in Egypt. It has been linked to disturbances in Egypt's modern history before, going back to the days of Anwar al-Sadat, hasn't it? And the last few months we've seen, according to the official statistics agency, CAPMAS, even they report that in urban areas we had, for example, in September, prices rising 14.1%. The month before that, 15.5%. It's kind of improved a bit this month because the government took steps towards devaluation of the currency. But everyone is, a lot of the economists are saying this is not going to last. How dangerous a development is that?
I think it's very dangerous. And I think the reason why it's so dangerous, in some ways even more dangerous to the government than these terrorist groups, these insurgents, is because the economic situation affects all Egyptians. There was just a report about how the devaluation of the pound and the increased price of imports, in particular sugar and other common goods, are affecting the common Egyptian families in the middle class, lower class, and even in the upper class. It's difficult to make a cup of tea in Egypt. So
what's the plan? I mean, does the government have a plan, or are the economics in free fall, as some of the opposition claim?
Unfortunately, the regime's economic strategy has failed abysmally, right? We're talking about a government that their prize project was the Suez Canal expansion. That has failed dramatically. In fact, not only have revenues from the canal not increased, they've decreased by tens of millions of dollars year over year. You have this, the Al-Jazeera, the new capital, the Dubai-like capital that they were planning on building. That has, plans for that capital have fallen through. So there's not really a sustained plan to get Egypt back on its economic legs. The major problem, and this is why all of the crises in Egypt are related, right? You have the political crisis, the economic crisis, and the security crisis. They're all tied together. Because these insurgents, the terrorist attacks, what they do is they scare away foreign investors. No one's going to put
their money in a country.
Exactly. They scare away foreign investors. They scare away tourists. Egypt is an economy that relies fundamentally on tourism, which has decreased dramatically in the Sisi era. So until the government can do something to convince people to come back to Egypt, we're not going to see the pound rebound, and we're not going to see any sort of an economic revival.
Omar, what about international backing? To what extent can Egypt still rely on Gulf money, Gulf Arab money coming in to save the day?
Not so much, really. Egypt has been more or less taking a lot of, I wouldn't say Egypt, but I say the Sisi regime specifically, been taking quite a few financial aid packages from the Gulf, but politically behaving in a way that contradicts Saudi specifically and most of the Gulf foreign policies, especially in areas like in issues like the Syrian crisis, issues like the Yemeni crisis. And most recently, even issues that has to do with the the Moroccan Polisario conflict, where so you had the vote in the Security Council for the continuation of Russian bombardment on Aleppo, which contradicts what the Saudi stance and the Gulfian stance in general. And you had this, big promises that they can help in Yemen militarily if the aid comes. The aid comes and there's no help in Yemen, and no involvement there, mainly for internal dynamics to keep the balances within the military. And then more recently, meeting up with the Polisario front in an attempt to go a bit closer to Algeria and perhaps get some energy aid from the Algerians, but at the same time, causing a negative reaction on the part of the Moroccans and on the part of the Gulfians as well, who do not uphold the Polisario cause. So the relation has been quite tense. And the whole strategy is about where to get aid from. It's aid intensive or aid seeking strategy, but it does not look internally on how to resolve actually the crisis. It's just about extracting some money, some economic bonanza from somewhere. And it's not, this is a tactic, just to alleviate some or to buy some time. But it's not really a comprehensive economic strategy to do any kind of reform. And of course, any kind of economic reform in Egypt would require a political and social reform, would require social depolarization, would require political de-escalation, and will require a whole set of reconciliation policies that I don't think this regime can afford to do.
Well, Fik, what about other international countries, the West? It seemed like after the overthrow of the first democratically elected president that the West changed its view back to the military or security narrative and stability narrative, regardless of the price of human rights in the region. Do you see any reason to suspect that that might change if there's smoke and the rumblings coming out of the engine?
I think the West is distancing itself slowly from Sisi and his government. Because Sisi
How so? What signs and
credibility.
indications have you noticed that make you reach that conclusion?
I noticed that when Sisi went to the United Nations, for example, he hardly met any Western leaders. Certainly, Obama have shunned him away in the G20 meetings and at the United Nations. And I feel Sisi is in real trouble. And actually, he's a big obstacle for Egypt moving forward. And I think the military probably confused what to do because they don't have any political vision, because any political vision has to entail political reform, have to entail civil society, have to entail democracy, rule of law, getting people out of prison to create form of trust, because you're not going to have trade, you're not going to have tourism as long as such negative vibes comes from Cairo about killings, about security situation in Sinai. There's hardly any tourism from any country, even the country which is friendly. And some countries in the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia, have a lot of thoughts which are not comfortable for Sisi. And I think Egypt have received about $50 billion in aid from the Gulf countries since Sisi came to power. And there's a huge corruption rings siphoning out this money because it does not show on the ground. There is a shortage of sugar, wheat, food. There is poverty, and actually I would think there will be starvation very soon in Cairo.
A very worrying sort of
Egypt.
scenario being painted there. And when you have the political process being smashed and fractured by, the abuses of human rights, which a lot of organizations have documented, what sort of picture does that paint for the future stable political evolution in Egypt?
Not a pretty one. Many analysts have predicted that another uprising, another revolution in Egypt is not a matter of if, but when, right? And Dr. Wafik.
Do you really think there's appetite for that on the streets?
Well, I think that Egyptians are getting to the point. It's sort of that breaking point. When is it going to happen? I don't think anybody knows. Are we talking about months, or are we talking about years? But so many Egyptians are struggling with sort of their day-to-day lives, right? They're not able to buy. They're not able to buy enough, food to put on the table.
So that's always danger point.
At some point, you're going to reach a boiling point, right?
All right, thanks so much. We are out of time. Let's thank our guests, Mohamad Elmasry here in the studio, Omar Ashur and Wafiq Mustafa. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.